How does Tyler Robinson's anti-fascist and pro-trans motivation compare to John Brown's violent push against slavery? And was Brown seen as a terrorist back then, like how some might label extremists today?
Um, yeah, I mean, Brown was definitely seen as a terrorist, certainly by people in the South. Um, Tyler Robinson is comparable to Brown in sort of the fanaticism, the willingness to resort to violence. If and I have to say, if it turns out he's guilty of the crime of which he's been accused, that's one of the interesting differences. Is that it was kind of immediately known. I mean, there was no Brown didn't dispute it. He was, actually quite cooperative, during his trial, and by all accounts, even cooperative with the hangman, to the end. Tyler Robinson is not cooperating with authorities. And there are doubts, which we'll probably get into later, about has he been set up in some way, this kind of thing. But as alleged, they're claiming that uh, he's got ties to some militant, kind of pro, trans slash pro furry ideologies. He's got a boyfriend who's transitioning and is in furry culture, and so this is all swirling around. So it's certainly setting up a similar levels of cultural significance. I don't see similars in terms of the martyr potential, the way Brown had, but he certainly has the potential to be similarly catalytic in terms of igniting, taking the cultural divide to the next level.
I've heard reports about Robinson's ties to a group called Quiz Salt Lake City. Did Brown have any network like that, or was he more of a lone wolf?
He was definitely not a lone wolf. He actually received funding from a very well-heeled, well-connected group, mostly Boston-based elites known as the Secret Six. Two of them were Unitarian ministers, and one was an industrialist. And they actually diverted funds that I guess New England-based donors mostly had given in good faith to support the settlers in Kansas, with provisions, including weapons, actually. But I mean, Kansas was a dangerous place to settle, so fair enough. But anyway, this was money that had been meant for Kansas that was actually diverted, for what is a treasonous act. It's an attack on the federal arsenal. So, I mean, they, and it's, I think it's fair to say that most of them did not behave particularly honorably after it kind of came out, that Brown had gotten funded. A lot of them kind of, like I think a couple of them fled to Canada. One of them was already in Italy and actually dying, poor health. Only one of them, I think, really actually kind of stuck up for what he had done. But there's absolutely a conspiracy in the case of John Brown. With Tyler Robinson, there seem to be some indications of involvement with somebody else. There was this group, and they'd sort of posted some strange things and took it down. So it's not clear how organized it was. And there are, of course, questions about, was he in some way either falsely accused, or was he actually, being in some ways put up by other interests? One difference between John Brown and Tyler Robinson is that, Brown was kind of lionized and celebrated by Northern abolitionists. Robinson isn't really being owned, I would say, and embraced that by that many people on the left. I mean, there have been people literally celebrating Charlie Kirk's assassination, um, at the most extreme. And then a more common reaction is kind of like, well, it's a variation actually on a tasteless, but, arguably hilarious joke that Chris Rock, the comedian, used to make about Nicole Brown Simpson, the wife of O.J. Simpson, who O.J. killed. He was doing this rant in his stand-up comedy about, the divorce laws and how hard they are on men, and so his refrain was, "I'm not saying he should have killed her, but I understand." And people kind of take that attitude about the Charlie Kirk assassination. Well, I'm not saying he should have killed him, but I understand. So it's not so much about praising Tyler Robinson as disparaging Charlie Kirk. It's like he was a racist, he was a homophobe, he was a transphobe. He supported the Second Amendment, and said that some level of gun violence was acceptable in exchange for freedom. What do you expect? I'm not saying he should have killed him, but I understand. So Robinson isn't exactly a martyr in that sense. If it turns out he was falsely accused, that could, he could become sort of a political martyr in that sense for the rights of the unjustly accused. But it seems like actually most of the people who are raising questions about about the official story and whether the government has the right guy, it seems like most of those people are actually on the right, on the political right, not so much on the left. So, that's an interesting. So Robinson is like Brown in sort of the fanaticism. If he's the correct guy, and what we're hearing is correct, then he's like John Brown in his fanaticism and kind of reckless criminality and delusion, about what this would achieve. But he's unlike John Brown from the martyrdom standpoint.
If John Brown was a martyr for the abolition of slavery, what cause will Charlie Kirk be remembered for as a martyr?
Well, so the left is hoping he won't be remembered as a martyr, as I was mentioning. I mean, they're trying to kind of downplay the tragedy of it, I would say, or they're sort of limiting it to, well, it's sad anytime anyone dies from gun violence, but he brought it on himself. He was a racist. He stood for white supremacy. They're really trying to pile on as much hostility to his legacy as possible. And my prediction would be that will have the opposite effect, that they are actually amplifying his martyrdom. Okay, so what is he a martyr for? Well, as far as the right's concerned, he's absolutely a martyr for free speech and for speaking your faith in the public square and not being afraid to let it influence your politics and your advocacy. I mean, that's actually a longstanding tradition in the United States that has somewhat been suppressed in, I would say, sort of in the late 20th century onward. The culture has been more that the courts started ruling, well, there's, what the First Amendment really does is it mounts this strict wall of separation between church and state. And I mean, really, all it says is Congress shall make no law establishing, it's the Establishment Clause. I mean, the Supreme Court got rather creative in the late 20th century, and I think you're seeing some of that jurisprudence being unwound with things like the abortion ruling and other issues recently. But you're also seeing just kind of somewhat of a return to religious expression in connection to kind of political subject matter. And Charlie Kirk kind of represented that. So Christians will see him as a martyr for Christianity as well. And then there's a question of, okay, so yes, he's a martyr for free speech. Now, what is the nature of his free speech martyrdom? Okay, as far as they were concerned, he was speaking the truth about, trans ideology, about issues like, what he saw as the problem of, fatherlessness in Black communities. He was staunchly pro-life, which some on the left will just say that equals misogyny. So was he a martyr for those causes? For ostensibly what Tyler Robinson seemed to be killing him for? Or some people on the right are asking, was he a martyr for a newfound critical attitude towards Israel and its prosecution of the war in Gaza and its influence on American politics? Charlie Kirk had been known as a very staunchly pro-Israel champion, as many evangelicals are. Had been to Israel, visited the holy sites. It meant so much to him, etc. But he had been speaking out, most notably on the Megyn Kelly show in recent weeks, talking about, you know, what sounded like harassment. I mean, from many, well-connected Jewish political insiders accusing him, of not only not being sufficiently supportive of Israel, but actually being an anti-Semite and, out and out attacking his character. And he was, furious about that. And, text messages have been released, I think that he had, like a group text that he sent out like 48 hours before his death, saying that, oh, we just lost another, $2 million a year donor, Jewish donor, because I had invited Tucker Carlson to one of our events. Yeah, because he'd had Tucker Carlson at an event. He had sponsored a debate on Israel in which Dave Smith, who's a comedian turned like outspoken libertarian and pro-Palestinian rights advocate, I would say, and very critical of the war in Gaza, although Dave Smith himself is Jewish. And many of the critics actually, both in the US and in Israel, of the prosecution of the war in Gaza are themselves Jewish. But at any rate, he was getting called anti-Semitic just for not being enough of a cheerleader towards the end. And he was, clearly angry about it. And he says in this group text that this is, leading him to sort of basically abandon the pro-Israel cause. And so that, combined with general dissatisfaction about the government's handling of the arrest. I mean, they announced a couple of arrests before Tyler Robinson was arrested. There was just a lot that was botched. There are questions about, the trajectory of the bullet. And the strange thing is that Kash Patel, the FBI director, after basically, having announced and said that, Tyler Robinson's the guy, announced that they were also continuing to investigate all these other questions, which whether he meant to do that or not actually lends credibility to them. So it's that is still very much up in the air. What exactly is the nature of Charlie Kirk's martyrdom? And that is going to be contested in a way that I think, John Brown's, it was, is he a martyr or is he just a terrorist? And so, but that was, according to the North, a martyr, according to a little more complicated. According to the North, a martyr or a nut. You definitely, the official party line actually, but in the 1860 Republican convention was, oh, we condemn John Brown's actions, and it was, Abraham Lincoln, he in one of his famous speeches, kind of went on at some length about, what an idiotic plot it was. And even the slaves themselves knew how stupid it was and blah, blah, blah. And so there was all this, the establishment, Republicans, were officially against it. But, the fire comes from, the ultras, the extremists. But anyway, so yeah, it's like it was, so there was some question of like, is he a martyr or just a fool in the North? And then as far as the South was concerned, he's just an evil terrorist and look who those Yankees are for supporting him, but in the case of Charlie Kirk, yeah, it's more complicated, like what is he a martyr for? And you've had Benjamin Netanyahu come out and publicly deny twice that Israel had anything to do with his death. That's an unusual development. And no one, and the thing is, I guess, given the low trust in institutions that exists right now, even people who support the Trump administration, have this idea that, well, but the deep state is still really running things. And so, who's really pulling the strings? The complete lack of confidence that the Justice Department's handling of the Jeffrey Epstein files doesn't help this stuff at all,